who will go in the same order as they have been identified on the program. Each presenter has 10 minutes, and then each presenter has a respondent that also has 10 minutes, and then we have 10 minutes for discussion, questions, and comments. So each person has 30 minutes allocated to them. So our first presenter is Claudia, and she is her talk is on the history of European disability movements, and she is an early stage researcher or a PhD student at the University of Leeds. Please go ahead, Claudia.
Thank you, Ranvik. I hope the microphone is working. Yes, so my research looked at some past campaigns that were run by the European Disability Forum and its partner organizations. And in doing this, I wanted to understand what types of tactics and strategies had been used in some successful campaigns or landmark campaigns to understand what lessons could be drawn for future activism and advocacy. So I'll talk a bit more about a practical tool that I'm developing out of the research. But the aim of the project was to look at how civil society organizations like the EDF have operated within existing governance structures and a campaign within these, but also how their activity has influenced the structures themselves. And I might just go straight to the changes, which was what we were asked to present for the talk, and then in questions, if people want to ask more about the project itself, they can. But probably one of the changes that my research spoke to the most was the need for more channels of communication between civil society and European institutions of governance. But with that more kind of permanent, so the EDF and its partners have been quite successful in embedding themselves in decision-making processes and kind of more permanent forums for communication. And I've looked at what kinds of successes have been achieved through these channels, but considering the amount of time and resources that organizations like the EDF put towards consultation and advising, more kind of accountability mechanisms could be in place for the European institutions to demonstrate how they're taking on board those consultations and implementing the what comes out of those consultations, and also ensuring that the voice of the movement is extended to include smaller organizations, and they're being used to represent a range of voices from movements like the disability movement. The research also kind of pointed towards a need for more resources to go towards national and local DPOs to address member state level issues and ensure that the impact of European level policy is felt at the grassroots level. And this requires strong advocacy by national and local DPOs for good transposition of policy from the European level, particularly because lots of European level umbrella style organizations don't tend to involve themselves with national level politics. And more generally, capacity building exercises and activities between EU level civil society organizations and their members should continue to be focal points of organizations like the EDF. So peer learning and exchange programs to talk about best practice in campaigning and activities more generally have all been kind of features of these campaigns that have been successful or landmark. And as a formal space, civil society is in the EU is one that is sort of gate kept by the state, and organisations that participate in these spaces are invited or selected through invitation or funding. So organisations that operate in this formal space do have a responsibility to the movement to make sure that they represent the movement that they speak on behalf of fully. And in terms of research about European civil society or civil society in general, one thing that my research kind of raised was that a lot of social movement literature begins from the assumption of protest and contentious activity, and there's much less attention on kind of cooperative strategies between the state and and social movement organizations. So that area could benefit from further research. So too could the idea of coalition building within civil society. So we know that civil society is a very strategically important space for social movement organizations to come together and forge alliances, articulate different visions of society. But my research also raised examples of when that broke down. And again, this is something that I didn't see reflected in the literature. So more research on civil society as a space of competition, where there's a finite amount of resources and attention and time. And the advocacy work of the EDF also pointed to finally a third area of literature, or dearth of literature, which is viewing the kind of interrupting the idea of the binary between state and civil society, because the successes of the EDF and its partners have been achieved in part due to the connections of on-site or internal allies within the state. So where the kind of barrier is between state and civil society, and what constitutes an ally and who is part of the movement, deserves more attention. So I'll also just talk a bit about this framework of collective action that I'm in the process of making with input from the people I've spoken to for my research. I'm creating this with the mind that it can be a very practical tool for civil society organizations and DPOs to use in future campaigns. And I'm hoping to receive some rounds of feedback before this is finalized, but I thought I'd just present the work in progress. So one of the points that seem to be quite fundamental in a successful campaign is expertise. And by that I mean kind of utilizing the lived experience of disabled experts, but also employing researchers, seeking data to reinforce the aims of the campaign, and also perhaps translating this to the kind of logic of the target institutions if that's needed. So understanding the agenda of the institutions and making sure that the campaign is framed in a way that the institutions will be receptive to. And so internal allies, again, are kind of crucial for that, and crucial in understanding who the change makers might be within these European institutions or state institutions, extracting information from the institutions, understanding more about deadlines and decisions before they're perhaps official. This was a big feature in successful campaigns that I was looking at. Also, information feeds in terms of as well as information coming out of target institutions, but also running into the network of the campaign. So making sure that campaigners working within the network are informed of the campaign, generally understand and support the campaign. So that's why I've said activation of network, understanding the aims and goals of the campaign, exchanging knowledge and best practice tactics throughout the campaign, and also making sure that the network has mechanisms where actors can raise issues and give input to shape the campaign. So ensuring that decision-making is shared amongst actors in the campaign. And also flexibility in the campaign. So if we're talking about EU level campaigning, we're talking about a huge variety of regional and local cultures. But even on the national level, this could be the case. So also ensuring that the network of the campaign is able to mold itself according to its location, and tailoring the campaign to kind of local and regional preferences. And I might just end with one of the questions that that my research has raised, which is, when does a campaign end? Because we're talking a lot about policy, good policy, but we also have to think about implementation. So when can organizations kind of let up pressure? It can't be at the point of policy, because the most beautiful, incredible policy, if it's not implemented correctly, isn't going to make any difference. So that's a question that I might leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That is such a rich area to explore, and I'm really happy for your work in this area. So I would like to give the floor to Jolene Santecos, who is online.
Yes, I am.
Can I ask you to please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Jolijn Santegoets. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm a person with lived experience of mental health and psychosocial disability. I'm a board member of the European Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry and a co-chair of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. And I'm also a board member of EDF. So this presentation, it brought a lot of thoughts. In fact, it's maybe a pity that it's a summary because it's so interesting and I would have loved to have more ins and outs. And the title actually made me think that it would maybe have been more about empowerment and emancipation from the lived experience perspective, and not only the European Disability Forum, but like a broader European movement, also including Council of Europe maybe. So those were a little bit of my expectations, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe because it was a summary, it wasn't brought up so much. I think it's always important to bring the history, which also relates to the lived experience, and the reason why many of us became an activist is in the personal history and the personal how to call it, experiences, rather than some knowledge from a book. And I find that a very convincing core of the civil society movement or the disability movement as it is. So those were actually more of my expectations, that it was a broader dynamic than the European Disability Forum, which is of course a very important vehicle and ally and platform and tool and campaign. So perhaps you can clarify a little bit more on the broader perspective, if I may ask.
I can try, but I have to say that.
Sorry to interrupt. Jolene, we have some problems hearing you properly. If you could speak a little closer to the microphone so everyone can hear you. We here at the high table, mind you, we can hear you well, but some other people have problems. So after, if you could move a little closer. Thank you. To the microphone. Thank you.
Yes, I've done. Is this better?
Oh yeah, much better.
Okay.
Claudia, please go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
So the campaigns that I was looking at were run in conjunction with other DPOs, but I was looking at EU level campaigning, and I was working with the EDF on this. So I was primarily looking at the campaigns that the EDF has run in partnership with other organizations. I'm not sure that I'm answering your question properly, but I haven't. Maybe you can clarify. Sorry.
Okay. Well, in a very simple way, the EU is not everything.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's also Council of Europe. There is national reform. There is a broad push from alliances like European NGOs who join their efforts, and they may not necessarily be EU issues. They could be Council of Europe issues, for example, with mental health coercive legislation. So this is my worry. The title, History of European Disability Movements, suggests like a very broad picture. And if it's narrowed down to the EU, that is a bit problematic from my perspective, if I may say so.
Yeah. that is very true. And that is something that I would consider for further research. But this research did focus primarily on the European Union.
I fully understand, and we can talk about this later if you want to.
Yeah, please.
You're very welcome.
Have you completed your comments, Jolien? Or do you have further comments or questions?
I think those were my main concerns. Yeah, I'm interested to hear what Eleanor has to bring.
Okay, thank you very much. So has Eleanor raised her hand?
Yes.
No, we are open for questions and comments from anyone present, online or in person.
Great.
Please go ahead, Eleanor.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much, Claudia. I'm really interested in your case studies, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what those specifically were, what specific campaigns you really scrutinized, and maybe if there is, perhaps there's no consensus on what counts as success from your participants and your research using these case studies. So you mentioned that it's certainly not over once the policy is changed. We have to, continue to fight on the implementation front. But yeah, I'd be really interested if there were consensus or very different viewpoints on what counted as success in those case studies.
Shall I answer now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah. So I picked 3 campaigns, and they were kind of from the beginnings of the EDF becoming an independent organization up until kind of now. So I picked the Invisible Citizens campaign, which was the campaign by the EDF. Well, it started before the EDF was an official organization, but it was demanding recognition of disability in the Amsterdam Treaty. And then the subsequent legislation that came out of that recognition. I also looked at the push for a horizontal non-discrimination directive. So the 1 Million for Disability campaign that became a broader campaign for a horizontal directive. And then I looked at the Accessibility Act. So the beginnings of the European Union attempting to meet its obligations of the CRPD and the frameworks that kind of came out of that, and one of which was the Accessibility Act. And actually, one of the reasons that I picked those 3 campaigns was because I was interested in the different types of success that kind of came out of those 3 campaigns. So one of them was a very important campaign that led to some very strong legislation, I'm told, by the people I spoke with. The 1 Million for Disability campaign was a very kind of strategically successful campaign. It was very strategically executed, and it was a technical success. But we're still waiting for this legislation to appear. And there were some complications along the way with what legislation was proposed and what was kind of being campaigned for, I guess, in the end. And the Accessibility Act, depending on who you speak with, could maybe be stronger. So this was a campaign that achieved legislation, but perhaps not what was asked for in terms of the strength of the act. So I think, yeah, there are kind of 3 types of success there. So there's kind of the policy outcome. There's a successful campaign that people spoke about with very affectionate feeling, and a feeling of kind of that it generated a lot of solidarity within the people who conducted the campaign and were involved in the campaign. And then also, yeah, this idea, I guess, of when the campaign ends and when organizations stop working on legislation, because the EDF was involved and its partner organizations were involved very far along the process, and now they're very involved in transposition. The member organizations are involved in the transposition of this legislation into national level policy. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think it's really interesting that you have chosen all examples that have, either very strong success, in the views of those involved or impacted by it, or maybe some qualified success, but you didn't choose any example that was maybe more of an outright failure, which we know in activism and advocacy is common as well. Was there a reason for that, or is that something that you might, be interested in pursuing perhaps in further research? Because I understand you have to limit what you do in this project.
Yeah, that's maybe, I think I would be too, well, I did, the campaigns that I picked were kind of based on what was suggested to me, and I can understand why maybe people thought, oh, you should talk about the 1 million for, well, maybe not the 1 million for disability campaign, but the Invisible Citizens campaign, because, this is a really strong piece of legislation and a strong campaign. But to be honest, some people did see the 1 million for disability campaign as a failure. So not all people I spoke to saw that as a success, and they felt like it was kind of a waste of energy in the end, and a bit kind of upsetting. But yeah, that would be a really interesting next step for the research. Thanks, Eleanor.
All right, thank you both. We have a question from the room. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, hello? Frank Connerty from Menulai, Galway. Claudia, that was great, and this is a really critical area of research, and putting my accounting hat on, you probably might anticipate where the next question might be coming from. You cited accountability mechanisms as key, and I was just wondering, in terms of the campaigns you looked at, how would you characterize the accountability mechanisms that you did see? And if you would classify them as being effective or ineffective, if ineffective, what might good accountability mechanisms look like, or have you considered that?
Yeah, well, I think, so with the second campaign, the idea of using this kind of instrument, so it was based on the European Citizens Initiative, and it was kind of the first usage of this new instrument that was kind of meant to prompt more kind of engagement between European citizens and the Commission in particular. So the idea was if you got over 1 million signatures from the European citizenry on an issue, then the European Commission would be prompted to kind of propose some legislation. So that sounds like a really good accountability kind of mechanism, and the European Commission did propose some legislation. It wasn't the legislation that was asked for in the original campaign, so I guess you could say that maybe it wasn't as impactful or as an accountability mechanism in that sense. Also, I noticed when I was looking at the Accessibility Act, but also the kind of decade-long, first European disability strategy more generally, it did take a number of years for these frameworks to be kind of implemented, and it just seems, if I was to comment on how effective the accountability mechanisms that are in place, how effective they are, it seems like the doggedness that organizations have to ask for their interests to be kind of represented in, it seems not to be reflected in the response of the Commission, if that makes sense. So and timing, but also kind of the strength of the response, if that makes sense. So kind of, that I think I haven't thought enough about what a very efficient, effective accountability mechanism might look like, but perhaps reducing the time and being more proportionate to the resources and time that the DPOs give to giving position papers and kind of contributing to those discussions.
That's good. And just that maybe that if you've identified a potential issue in the area, that it's really good to highlight it as an area that requires further research and further investigation. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you both. We have Paul from Stockholm University who has raised his hand. I can't see his last name. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Paul Lappalainen from Stockholm University. I had a question about, I'm sorry, I missed part of your presentation, but I was wondering if you looked at cooperation with external allies in Brussels. If you're looking at success issues, external allies like ILGA, European Network Against Racism, European Women's Lobby, do they provide support on common issues or on separate issues that deal with disability alone?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, it was very, so it does, the, organization or platforms like the social platform kind of show the cases in which all of these organizations will campaign together on certain issues, definitely. And eventually the campaign for the horizontal directive obviously became a joint campaign for an overarching non-discrimination directive for these groups that were present in the employment directive after the Amsterdam Treaty. I did notice that the EDF and its partners do seem to campaign quite specifically on disability issues, as just in the campaigns that I was looking at and the activity of the EDF. So there are kind of broader, civil society kind of fights, I guess, that are embarked on together. But I also, my understanding is that the nature of some disability advocacy is calling for quite specific adjustments or legislation that is, and I don't know if maybe there's an argument that this could easily be extended to, to include other groups, but yeah, it does seem like it's quite targeted, if that makes sense.
The reason I bring it up is, at least when I've seen the others, I think they also tend to be looking primarily at their own issues. They can participate in social platform and say, okay, we'll support each other, but they don't really carry it out as far as I can tell. And that's with regard to each of the interests.
Yeah.
They're all focused on their own interests, but it seems like they would have a bigger voice if they supported each other on common interests or even on separate interests. But
I do wonder sometimes those interests could conflict, but also I started to wonder if it was almost by, not to sound too cynical, but design of civil society as it kind of currently operates in the European Union, because it is a kind of competition for, resources and attention in a way. And I understand, maybe it could be completely sort of overhauled, but I do think, one of the reasons is because you have to be trying to kind of put your voice forward, for the people you represent.
that's why I'm asking the question, because at least I'm calling from Sweden. What I see is there's a lot of competition, partly internally within the disability movement, concerning funds. Where do we get our funds? It's from the public sector. So we have to specialize in our disability. And also in regards to discrimination grounds, we have to specialize in regards to our discrimination, which means what Gerald was talking about earlier, it's harder to mobilize enough pressure
So
if you present yourself as representing a special interest. So there's a conflict there. And also the public funding is, all of the people working in Brussels, they're good people, but they're also very dependent on the European Union or on the Commission. So it's a difficult line to walk.
Yes.
But hopefully that'll come up at least a little bit in your research as well.
Yeah,
it's a tougher part to bring up, but I think it's important.
Yes, it is certainly has come up, but it's kind of raised the questions that you've articulated there, Paul, very well. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all. Thank you, Claudia, very much. And now we move on to our next presenter, which is Adriana, who is from Maastricht University, and her presentation is titled "Voting Matters: An Analysis of the Use of Electoral Assistive Devices Through the Lens of the UN CRPD." Go ahead.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
Adriana.
I pronounced it like you, no worries. So thank you so much. My research centers on the opportunity of persons with disabilities to enjoy the right to vote in elections in practice, or let's say the de facto realization of the right to vote by persons with disabilities. And it concerns the European context, mainly two countries, England and Spain. And I have particularly analyzed these countries' compliance with Article 29A of the CRPD, the convention. And this article sets out several legal obligations for states parties, including that persons with disabilities have access to accessible voting materials, can exercise a secret and independent ballot, and can express their free will as voters through, among others, positive measures that include making reasonable accommodations to individual voters and providing them with assistive and new technologies for the removal of barriers caused by inaccessible voting materials. And this is the provision and use of these technologies is the particular focus of my study. So in the context of voting, these kind of assistive devices are called electoral assistive devices, and already exist in different countries in Europe and in other countries to assist voters with disabilities when voting throughout the electoral process. For example, for voter registration purposes, persons with disabilities can use voter instructions formatted in Braille, or they can use magnifiers at polling stations for marking their ballot papers. And also in some countries, people can use electronic voting machines using screen enlargement applications. So as such, my study contributes to the research in the field of political participation of persons with disabilities. And it has led to at least 4 main or key findings that I want to talk about today. The first one is that my study demonstrates that the use of assistive technology in elections is one measure for achieving greater accessibility in the voting environment. So I have identified several available and emerging electoral assistive devices that can be used to assist persons with disabilities when voting. I found that the application of these devices, meaning how these devices are used, shows a common trend towards assisting an individual's performance when marking their ballot papers at polling stations over other activities and over other voting procedures, for example, voting by post. So this means that the application of assistive technology in elections doesn't cover on the same degree all the electoral all the electoral related activities that require voters' direct participation. For example, making an informed political choice or even knowing election results. I also found that these electoral assistive devices can be used by multiple groups of voters, including persons with disabilities and, for example, language learners. Also, the available devices range from low-tech to high-tech devices. So this means that states can make available mechanical, meaning manually operated and affordable devices, as well as power source or electrically operated and expensive devices. And in my opinion, this is an important finding because given that assistive technological solutions might be inaccurately considered to be always costly, but my study demonstrates that many available devices are reasonable price. Okay, so well, the second finding that I want to talk to you is that the legal interpretation of Article 29A CRPD that I present in my study reflects the evolving understanding of the relationship between immediately and progressively realizable obligations. So under Article 29A CRPD, this immediately realizable or negative obligation of states to respect and ensure the right to vote is reinforced by the progressively or positive progressively realizable or positive obligation to provide accessibility in the voting environment. And this includes providing accessible voting materials. So in short, the legal interpretation of Article 29 A CRPD revealed that these anti-discrimination prohibitions applicable in the context of voting are only effective when linked with equality measures. Again, such as providing electoral assisted devices to be used by voters with disabilities, basically to remove these inaccessible realities from within the voting environment. And then I feel happy to say that after having comprehensively interpreted Article 29 A CRPD, my study moves from law in books to investigate law in action, or what I call Article 29A CRPD in action. So first, I have identified whether relevant English and Spanish laws and policies are in compliance with Article 29A CRPD. And second, I have assessed the degree to which electoral assisted devices as provided for by domestic law and policy are actually available to and actually used by voters with disabilities, based on a non-representative group of voters with disabilities and poll workers from England and Spain who were research participants in my study. And the focus of that examination lie on practices or social practices, and in its basic meaning on human actions taking place within national electoral systems that support or constrain the use of these devices by voters with disabilities. So, for example, this includes practices such as making available accessible electoral information so that persons with disabilities can make an informed political choice. And conversely, technical failures of these devices that diminish real opportunities for persons with disabilities to vote on an equal basis. This is particularly the case of England, for example. And well, the analysis of these practices led me to conclude that implementation of Article 29A CRPD can be enhanced or constrained, of course, not only by national legislation or policy, but also by practices of relevant actors, including, again, poll workers. And I have argued that addressing the legal and policy lacunae, as well as the practices within national electoral systems that I have identified in my study, would have a substantive impact in the effective implementation of Article 29A CRPD in England and Spain. But I hope that due to the interpretative rigor in data analysis in my study, the issues raised might be relevant or applicable to other countries, probably your own country. And this includes, of course, relevance for persons with disabilities, advocacy networks, national electoral authorities, legal and policy makers. I also think that my study has relevance for institutions at the European, at the Council of Europe and the European Union level, including the European Commission, and mainly in the context of the Union of Equality strategy. And I also think that the study could be interesting for the CRPD committee, to take into account some concrete examples of these devices in its general comments, including observations to states Paris. I will finish here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Well, as a person who is from a country where there is election on Saturday, this is very relevant to me, and we have been exactly focusing on implementing Article 29 around this election. So I'm very much on top of what you're saying, and I am really glad that you have come to such practical, suggestions about how we do it, not just how nice it looks on a policy paper. So we do have respondents. Alexandro Layo, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you? Yeah. Yes. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this event, and many thanks to the previous speaker and for her most interesting presentation. My name is Cristian Leahu. I'm a second national expert from Romania. I'm basically an election practitioner from there, and well, this topic is also of a personal interest to me. But in the next minutes, I'll try to provide a brief, let's say, overview of what the Commission has been doing on this topic and what the plans for the future are. So I'll begin to say that human dignity, along with democracy, equality, and respect for human rights, are among the core values upon which this European Union is founded. The Commission promotes inclusive participation in EU elections with due respect to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in particular its Article 29, and in line with these competencies. However, it should be noted that the organization of elections is a competence of the member states, which covers their responsibility to take appropriate measures to facilitate the participation of persons with disabilities in the framework of the applicable law and standards, including international agreements. The topic of voting accessibility for persons with disabilities is mentioned in several policy instruments of the Commission, and as I've said, I'll try to provide a brief overview thereof. The Commission noted, for example, in its report on the 2019 elections to the European Parliament, that persons with disabilities face diverse barriers in elections to the European Parliament, such as limited accessibility of premises and ballots. The same report announced that a specific focus of the Commission to support inclusive and equal participation for the 2024 elections will be also on people with disabilities, among other specific groups. Our European Democracy Action Plan announced the preparation of a compendium of voting practices together with member states, which, as stated in the strategy on the rights of persons with disabilities, should also seek to address the needs of citizens with a disability. Additionally, it announced a high-level event bringing together various authorities related to elections to address challenges outlined in this plan, which will take place in 2023. According to the strategy on the rights of persons with disabilities, discussions should include practices on inclusive democracy with the aim that candidate lists also reflect the diversity of our societies. The 2020 EU Citizenship Report also announced that the Commission would work with Member States and the European Parliament to guarantee political rights of persons with disabilities on equal basis with others, and in particular to ensure that this right is enjoyed in the next European Parliament elections. In a similar vein, in the strategy on the rights of persons with disabilities, in line with the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Commission committed to work with Member States, including through dedicated discussions in the European Cooperation Network on Elections and the European Parliament, to guarantee political rights of persons with disabilities on equal basis with others. It also announced it would establish in 2023, in close cooperation with member states in the framework of the European Cooperation Network on Elections, a guide of good electoral practice addressing participation of citizens with disabilities in the electoral process. On 25 November last year, the Commission adopted a package of measures to reinforce democracy and protect the integrity of elections. This included two recast legislative proposals, laying down detailed arrangements regarding the right of EU citizens residing in a different member state from their state of origin to vote and stand as candidates in elections to the European Parliament and municipal elections in their member state of residence. These proposals include an express requirement for member states to make electoral information accessible to persons with disabilities by using appropriate means, modes, and formats of communication. To support broad and inclusive participation, these proposals also envisage that access to remote and electronic voting means will be provided to mobile EU citizens under the same conditions as nationals of the member states of residence. The Commission also raises awareness about the rights of persons with disabilities and supports the exchange of good practices in the framework of the European Cooperation Network on Elections, including accessible voting machines and polling stations, adjustments and options for voters with disabilities. For example, in the European Cooperation Network on Elections is meeting on 24 January 2022, member states presented their work in ensuring that persons with disabilities can fully exercise their right to vote. This included introducing polling assistants at polling stations, adapting ballot boxes to help people with limited sight and reduced movement, as well as allowing for outdoors voting when voting stations do not allow access to people using wheelchairs, among other measures. In addition, some member states mentioned offering easy-to-read booklets and websites on elections, templates for blind or visually impaired voters, election helplines, and WhatsApp services for voters with hearing disabilities. The contribution of electoral assistive devices to the participation of persons with disabilities could also be further examined in our preparations for the Guide of Good Electoral Practice addressing participation of citizens with disabilities in the electoral process. Even if elections are essentially a celebration of democracy and essentially also reflect the culture and specificities and identities of a given democracy, national experiences of member states could be further explored as input and references for developing and establishing good generic practices. To delve deeper into the issue of implementing electoral assistive devices, several angles could be covered, such as the development of a needs-based approach, the responsible and transparent introduction and use of the necessary technology, the evaluation of its impact on elections, including voter turnout, costs, etc. Synergies between special voting arrangements implemented during the pandemic, such as mobile voting, postal voting, and even e-voting, and voting accessibility for persons with disabilities, could be another element to be analyzed. As announced in its communication on protecting election integrity and promoting democratic participation, issued on 25 November last year, the Commission will continue to use the European Cooperation Network on Elections to facilitate and improve the ability of all EU citizens to exercise their voting rights. This will include supporting the exchange of best practices and mutual assistance to ensure free and fair elections, and establishing common references on good practices for specific phases of the electoral cycle, including a nod, of course, to the voting rights of persons with disabilities. To conclude, I will say that challenges raised by the pandemic and the digital revolution present opportunities to advance measures aimed at improving the electoral participation of persons with disabilities. As accessibility has increasingly become a critical cross-cutting issue in the organization of elections, it has also pervaded our initiatives to promote the credibility and integrity of elections, and also to harness the opportunities of the digital transition to the new ways of doing democracies. Thank you very much. I'm, of course, available for any intervention you should require.
Thank you so much, Christian.
Thank you, Christian. Is your colleague Maria Safra there, or are you?
No,
Okay.
I'm basically accompanied by my colleague, but I opted to
Okay.
present alone this
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
commission, so this would be it.
Okay. So the floor is open for questions, or if you want to start, Adriana, by commenting on his reflections.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christian. Well, what you have said, I find that very interesting to hear. Definitely, the COVID-19 pandemic has make us all close to technologies, new technologies. It may be not the case assistive technologies, but at least to new technologies, ICTs, information and communication technologies, and the right to participate in political life was, as all human rights, but this in particular was very challenged by the measures that were adopted by states around the world. So elections were postponed in these two countries, in England and Spain. I was planning to go to do some observations of these elections, but I couldn't. So I think that the fact that hopefully the fact that now we are more familiar with these technologies, but also that states had the opportunity to identify what are the technological challenges that persons with disabilities are facing in their countries, could mean that national electoral authorities could be more willing to at least start thinking about the possibility of using assistive and new technologies in elections. I think that most of national electoral authorities around the world, it's not only the case in Spain, in England, assess as more important security, the principles linked to security in elections, that the principle of accessibility in elections, when the situation is that both principles are important to ensure that everyone, all eligible voters, can vote in elections. But I hope that this context, the context that the pandemic has created around us, means that accessibility and security in elections could be weighed at least more, I don't know how to say, equally, or trying to achieve a better balance between these two principles. The reality is that elections, paper-based, and elections running through electronic voting systems both face security and accessibility challenges. It's not true that an entire paper-based system can mean a more fair election. That's not true. I have read about this. Research shows that that's not the case. So definitely technology shouldn't be restraining elections. And again, if it is provided to all voters on an equal basis, that's important. It's not that using technologies should be restricted to persons with disabilities, or that this is the only option that persons with disabilities would have if available. Of course not. On an equal basis, that's an inclusive election system. What means? So yeah, thank you so much, Christian.
Thank you. So the floor is open and the screen is open. Lisa Waddington has raised her hand. Please go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you very much. So I'm Lisa Waddington. I'm a professor of European Disability Law at Maastricht University, and together with a colleague from EDF, Anne-Sophie, I've organised the training. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to our colleagues from the European Commission for joining us. Christian, thank you very much. Thank you for your intervention. Adriana, thank you also for your clear presentation on your research project. Now, Adriana, when you've been working on this, you've struggled a little bit in terms of what you should address with regard to the European Union. In terms of obviously there's a great deal of focus on Article 29 on the CRPD, which you've explored in detail quite rightly. You've looked at the ECHR and the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, and you also addressed the European Union in your thesis, and it wasn't always clear what's relevant, what's not relevant. And my question for you is this: Christian has talked about let's say mainly the soft law measures, all the kind of things that the Commission is doing regarding elections and voting and persons with disabilities, and some of them relate directly to assistive devices. Also, our colleagues from EDF will be able to update us more here. The European Parliament, I think quite recently, last week perhaps, even voted on a report about political participation, including persons with disabilities, and addressed assistive devices. So my question for you now is, and you know, I'm putting you on the spot, maybe you're going to say, Lisa, I'm going to come back to you next week. My question for you now is, having heard Christian, and he talked about, you know, these different actions, what do you think you would like to change in your manuscript, or if anything, with regarding what you're going to cover with regard to the European Union?
Thank you, Professor Lisa. Well, I was not familiar with some of the reports that Christian mentioned, so I think that's been very useful to hear about that. But also, I think that the Union of Equality strategy is will be developed further in the European Union level. And probably based on those developments, I will have the opportunity to update my analysis of the right to vote, the implementation of the right to vote at the European Union level. And yes, you're right. I struggle a lot with the European Union. Well, actually, with the European level, I'm not familiar with that. At all, and that was definitely it's been the most difficult chapter for me to write down. You're right in that, but also I think that that is because well, at the Council of Europe level, the European Court of Human Rights has not been consistent in using the CRPD. So let's say there is no even clarity coming from that, from the human rights core in Europe about how to implement Article 29, but not actually Article 29, or at least the European Convention in light of, or using Article 29 to interpret the relevant provisions on voting rights of the European Convention when applicable to persons with disabilities. So because of that, that has been very difficult for me to understand how to provide recommendations at that level. Yeah, and mainly, what can I say? Well, just the opportunity to know today, Christian. I will probably reach out to you in the future to update my chapter. Thank you so much, Professor Lisa.
Thank you. So we have 2 minutes left, but I think we can move on if that's okay with everyone. Okay, good. All right, so we move on to our next speaker, Marissa, who is at the Swiss Paraplegic Research, and she will talk about wise disability and end-of-life decision. Here you go, Marissa.
Thank you so much, Ranvik. Hi, everyone. My name is Marissa Diaz. My project is on voice, disability, and end-of-life decision-making. Like Ranvik said, I'm with Swiss Paraplegic Research, getting my PhD through the University of Lucerne in partnership with the University in Galway and UIG. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that sometimes it's quite difficult to engage with this topic on its face, especially from laypersons. And I would like to invite you all to, while I'm presenting, think about how you want your own end of life to be. Not necessarily how you die, that's a bit morbid, but do think about what you want. Think about who you want around you, where you want to be, what you want to do, and really try and meditate with that as I continue my talk. Because if I can call death a health outcome, I guess that is something that we all have in common, right? That is something that we will all face. And luckily, thanks to palliative care, social services, spiritual care, we can have a holistic approach to end of life, hopefully in the best of times. In order to have this kind of approach to end of life, we need access and lots of it. And this will become more important with population aging. More and more people will be dying of long illnesses, such as things like cancer. It will need kind of prolonged end of life care. And when we are considering how to build resources, we cannot leave out the needs of the vulnerable or people who have been historically marginalized or ignored. And this also includes people with intellectual disability. So today I will be talking with you about my findings for my pilot. I have just completed my data, I just gathered all my data, and I have not completed my data analysis. So these will be from the pilot. But these 3 findings from the pilot I want to talk about because there is a gap I will go on at length about with evidence for this population about this topic. And I wish to help fill that gap, hopefully with some of the findings from the pilot. So I'll begin with giving a little bit of a background to the issue because I find that people have a knowledge of intellectual disability, people have a knowledge of end of life care, but often people don't have a knowledge of both or how they really relate to each other. So kind of like the rest of the world, people with intellectual disabilities are also living longer than before. On average, they are still dying younger than people without intellectual disabilities. This is an important thing to acknowledge. And on a routine systemic basis, they encounter many barriers to care. And just because there is care doesn't mean they necessarily have access to it. So with regards to healthcare, they have issues with access, and with regards to palliative care. And this is from a range of different issues, from not necessarily getting referral to hospice care in time. There's also reluctance from the side of the carers to bring up end of life care. And there's also a lack of confidence. What I find interesting is that a lot of these barriers are the same for the rest of the population and for people with intellectual disability. End of life is hard. End of life is hard for everyone. It's hard to bring up. But with this population specifically, there is a definite barrier between palliative care services and intellectual disability services. They are usually rather separate, and there is usually sort of a divide between these services being connected. What I wanted to do is I wanted to explore what people with intellectual disabilities wanted out of their access during palliative care. And so what I did for my actual focus group was the data collection. And I worked with people with intellectual disability as my co-researchers. I have 3 in total from the inclusive research group, and 2 of them worked with me on the pilot for the focus group. I thought this was important because there has historically been a lack of information with this population, and I wanted to include them. A recent systematic review from Palliative Medicine was published in 2020, and it went over 50 or so articles about facilitators and access to care for people with intellectual disabilities. So out of those 50 some odd, there was 3,000 participants. 1% had people with intellectual disabilities in those studies, and none of them asked them what they thought about their barriers and facilitators to access. With that article in mind, me and my co-researchers had a pilot, and we focused on what we wanted in the focus group to talk about. And this brings me to my emerging findings from the pilot. I did this over Zoom for probably obvious reasons during COVID-19. And this was one of the reasons why I wanted to keep it on Zoom, was because to some, this is a sensitive topic. After all, it's hard to establish rapport and then say, well, what do you want at the end of your life? How do you wish to die? I wanted to have it be a little bit more intimate smaller, and a place where you can retreat to your room if needed. And in general, people appeared comfortable with the topic, but there were technical issues. There's also evidence to support that this is inherently limiting, especially for people with disabilities and intellectual disabilities. You have to have a degree of computer literacy, and you also have to have a good internet connection, which is not always accessible for everyone. So that is a limitation. As indicated in previous research, a methodology that kind of includes pictures and illustrates a story is very, very useful. And this is something that has been used since the 70s and 80s. There are researchers who've been working with end of life and intellectual disability who have always used pictures and easy read to describe a story, because sometimes it's rather hard, abstract, to think about what you want. So what I did on Zoom is I had a story with Mary and column, and I had illustrations on the left and a description on the right. And I said, Mary wants to get her home care at her home at end of life. Why do you think Mary would want to stay at the home? What would make her comfortable at home? What would get her what she wants at home? And then the same with column. I provided a binary between home and hospice care because those are the two extremes. You stay at home for end of life care or you go away. And what I found was, and I haven't done the data analysis, so I apologize that this is all kind of conjecture, or not conjecture, but it's just from the stories, were quite powerful. This is a population that is now outliving their parents, and those are their primary carers. And when I asked you before to imagine your own end of life, again, not the way you die, just what you want, I imagine you thought about someone in your own life who has died and what they went through. And I think that is one of the most natural human things to do, is to base your opinions off of something that you have seen and will eventually experience yourself. This is something we will all go through. The participants largely informed their own opinions based on the death of their parents, the death of their relatives, or in some cases, the death of their partners. Moving forward in terms of changes that I would like to see. So I had rather small focus groups, and I thought that this was beneficial because that means it would be less big crowds talking about death and dying. But I think this can be a jumping off point for important changes in the future. When I first started thinking about this, I did the very perhaps ableist thing of assuming what people wanted and what people needed, and that was about accessibility. And I'm never going to sit here and tell you that accessibility is not important. But in terms of Article 10 of the CRPD, right to life, there is palliative care in there because there's an access to healthcare, there's an access to getting what you want. And end of life, though unpleasant, though something we don't necessarily want to talk about or engage with, is something that we will all engage with. And it's one of those things that is better sooner as opposed to later. So looking forward with changes, I would like to see more cohesion between intellectual disability services on the ground and palliative care services, them reaching out to each other. I would also like to see more grassroots organization around bereavement, because bereavement, especially in certain cultures like the Irish context, which is where I did my study, it is important to be part of those funerary rites, because being part of those rites of death lead you to a point where you are imagining what you want. It's hard to imagine what you want if you haven't seen it. And of course, I would also like to engage more with people themselves. I was very, very pleasantly happy with my co-researchers who worked with me. And I was also very happy with the participants who wanted to talk about this for even longer. I wanted to have even more focus groups because oftentimes this is the first time they really talked about this or were asked. And so I think whether in the form of death cafes or more spiritual groups or maybe even educational groups in a hospital, I think there's a myriad of ways we can start engaging with our own bodies and our own mortality and look to end of life, not necessarily happily, but more realistically and making more of a peace with it. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. You think this is a very difficult topic, but this is the only thing that unites us all. We will all end up at the end of life. So I think we do not talk enough about it. So thank you for addressing it. I think that's really important. So we do have a slight change in the program. Instead of Joni Gisellen, we will have Eleanor Flynn. So, Eleanor, you were going to respond to this interesting topic that has been or will be close to us all. Some people say taxes and death is the only thing that everyone can rely on. So skip the taxes, pick the other one. Thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you so much. And Marissa, I think the work that you've completed is astonishing, especially in the global pandemic and with all the barriers and gatekeeping that you face to access participants. So that's the first thing that really strikes me from this research, and that I'd like maybe to give you the opportunity to speak a little bit more about. So when you mentioned in that systematic review that only 1% of those studies included people with intellectual disabilities, I think it's also interesting to consider that the majority of that 1% were studies that were conducted within disability services by staff who had direct access within disability services, which, ethically also presents a particular conflict of interest, right, in terms of how people choose to participate or not, and also what people might feel comfortable saying to staff that they're interacting with for their day-to-day support. So I think the fact that you, as an outside researcher, were able to make direct contact with people with intellectual disabilities who signed up to talk to you about end of life in this context is just incredible. And you should be so proud of having been able to achieve that. And I know the steps that we worked with you through to try to get participants were not easy. So perhaps that might just be something else that you want to reflect on as well for your own research and for other researchers interested in doing work in this area, which I agree is a fascinating field and definitely deserves more attention. The other thing that I would like to invite you to touch on, and you mentioned it at the end of your presentation, is around the role of culture and culture around death and dying and end of life. And I know you haven't, gotten into the meat of your data analysis yet, but I think this is going to be a really interesting focus or, issue to address in your analysis, because as you mentioned, there is a particular kind of culture around death and dying in the Irish context that you are examining. There is a culture in the general society of, everyone attending the funeral, so of funerals being large, which again has been impacted in the pandemic. And so that is interesting to consider that specific context as well. But in general, right, most of us would be very familiar with going to funerals and know the steps that happen at, the 3 days that over which the funeral takes place, and the different rites, as you mentioned, that are important to that and who gets to participate in those. And that is something that also historically, particularly for people with intellectual disabilities who are living in more institutional settings, who may not have had those same opportunities in the same way that people living in the community or in their families may have had. And so that's an interesting, and there's lots of research on a culture of secrecy around death and dying when it comes to people with intellectual disabilities, and how people are often not told about the deaths of others in a sort of well-meaning way, because it might be upsetting, but on the other hand, in a way that's quite infantilizing and damaging emotionally to the person as well. So I wondered if those are things that you expect to pick up on more when you really get into the meat of your data analysis, or things that you have preliminary thoughts about that would be interesting for the audience to hear more about. So I'll stop with those two comments for now, and we'll see if you want to respond, and then perhaps I can ask other things, or we can open up the floor.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Kind of going off of what you said about the culture surrounding death, my interest is in, primarily to a degree, thanatology, which is the study of the culture around death and death as a social kind of institute. That is not necessarily new, but as a cultural study, it is something that is really not looked at enough, because it is not even outside of healthcare. It is its own kind of sociological thing. And what I remember, just kind of thinking about my own experience, death is one of those things that's not culturally constructed. We do die, but the things around death are culturally constructed. For example, my great-grandfather was never going to die outside of the home because he was Mexican American. That was never going to happen. It would be extremely disrespectful. But where on the other side of my family, there were different options. They went to hospice. And so I think that it's important that moving forward, when we have the Irish context, which there are studies about this within intellectual disability, people with intellectual disability are much more involved in funerary rites in Ireland than the UK. And I think that is fascinating that there is such a distinct difference between those two countries alone. And I think that that can illuminate more research in the future, because when you're building these resources, I really don't think I believe in this context of a one-size-fits-all approach, because there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to death and dying. There's good practice, certainly, but I think that kind of ignoring the larger culture surrounding death that is going to be very individual for each country, it is a mistake. And I would have to situate my research, and I am, in a very Irish context with people who self-identify as having intellectual disabilities, who wanted to talk about death. That is to some degree, some might argue, a limitation and very narrowing. I see it as a jumping off point. Going to, when you mention institutions, I think that is extremely powerful, because one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of data on this is that people with intellectual disabilities have historically not lived that long. And we don't have to use our imaginations to wonder why. A lot of this is demographic, sure. A lot of this is improving healthcare, sure. But this is now a moment for this population to hopefully thrive in a way that they haven't before. So when we look at institutions, when we look at nursing homes, when we look at care homes, when we look at day centers, these are all places where people with intellectual disabilities live and may die. And I think that's the thing that's separating and kind of difficult for people to not comprehend, but to grapple with, is that if you live there, you can die there. And if you are there without the right resources, or without people taking very specific notice of what your needs are, they can be ignored in life and in death. So I think that's something to very important to engage with way before the end of life or dying process. Absolutely.
Maybe you can say a little bit more about specifically, the challenges for accessing people within services, because I know that is something, again, this is common to lots of researchers who want to work with people, particularly, I guess, people with intellectual disabilities often. But I think it's really relevant to your specific studies. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. I was very lucky to partner with the Inclusive Research Network, which is a group of self-advocates who are working with the University of Limerick, and they have intellectual disability, and they decide what kind of research they want to do and who they want to work with. And I had to approach them. With Eleanor's help, I approached them and I spoke with them about my study. I think that's something that I've learned that is really quite powerful to me, is that this population doesn't necessarily only want to talk about themselves, right? They want to be included in every facet. And I think that that's wise to approach it from that approach. So if I could go back, and even though this is very much population based, I would also focus on access to services in general for everyone. Kind of, there was a little bit of gatekeeping. There was people who perhaps found themselves a little uncomfortable with broaching the topic. For example, I was going through their supporters, right? I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that my participants all showed out without a supporter, without their parent, without someone who was caring for them, and they were able to do the actual focus group in the privacy of their own room. I think that's important. And it's not to say that the views of this of supporters and nurses and doctors aren't important. What I'm saying is that from that systematic review, we got their views. We got their views of this issue. That's done. Out of 3,000 participants, they represented the vast majority, 97%. And so I think that that's the approach that needs to be taken in the future. And I should have been more upfront with in the beginning, that this is an evidence gap. This is an evidence gap I'm trying to fill. This is something that really needs more engagement, because I feel like some people wonder, and it's not just some people in, the realm of disability studies, it's in academia, it's outside. Why are you talking to these people about that? And it's very patronizing, of course, but it's also very, very much normalized. And I think that is a very big step, one that I probably can't do alone, but a step in making this research more common and people more open to this as opposed to gatekeeping. I think that is a massive step forward that will probably take more couple years, maybe a decade to actually get to.
Great, thank you. That's all from me for now.
Thanks.
So the floor is open for questions or comments. Jerome, please go ahead.
I'm so proud. I don't want to say anything about that. Anyway.
It's our academic father speaking.
Never mind about that. Yes, certainly the overabundance of information from the profession is vis-a-vis the people who are actually impacted is overwhelmingly good evidence to say that we're have a huge evidence gap. And I think the profession still needs to get itself together. I'm just looking at the definition of palliative care by the profession, just to give you a sense of how they're dancing around things themselves. What is palliative care? It's an approach to improve quality of life for people who are facing problems associated with life-threatening illness. I mean, talk about euphemistic. I mean, where's death in that sentence? So the profession itself is actually unable to understand, frankly, its own what it's about. Now, I think, I mean, what would be interesting in your analysis to see, because I think from my experience, it would not be odd to find that people with intellectual impairments are much less squeamish, much less overwhelmed by the phenomena, because they are living lives which have had to negotiate a lot in their lives to get where they are. And among so their frankness and their realism about life in general, if you don't find it, you don't find it. But in the analysis, I think having some sense of the perspective, the unique perspective of people with intellectual impairments, given their life experience, their life history, and what they have had to live in other kinds of areas, will be fascinating. You do brilliant work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerome. Do we have other questions? Do you want to respond to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, kind stranger. When we talk about palliative care and its limits, I do think that is indicative of larger cultural shifts, specifically in healthcare itself, right? Because there's a lot of research in palliative care that asks the question, why do people still die in pain and terribly? It's 2022. Let's figure it out. And one of the biggest indicators is that sometimes a doctor isn't willing to admit, or a nurse isn't willing to admit, or a parent isn't willing to admit when it is the end, or sometimes they don't know, right? And so it's that kind of widening approach that I find is actually found more in palliative care as opposed to death studies and funerary care, because death positivity, which is largely a movement in the United States, is from funeral directors. It's from people who work on the ground. They're not necessarily kind of concerned with the curative element, and they're not going to be. They're funerary directors. And I think that's almost the approach to take with it, because within the realm of healthcare, obviously, they are the ones who will see a lot of death and be in charge, especially as long as pain relief is an essential issue in palliative care. Healthcare will be somewhat at the center. I think that is kind of hard to divorce. But I do think that as long as there is this focus on the curative element and the focus on, just not dying, period, we kind of worked day in, day out towards living older and living, longer and not dying. I think there will always be a resistance to engaging with this on a big level. And I think that's doing us all a disservice. I think that's doing everyone in this room a disservice. I think that's doing people with intellectual disabilities a disservice, because unfortunately, people without intellectual disabilities are often in charge of what people with intellectual disabilities have access to. So as long as we're doing ourselves a disservice, it's doing them a disservice.
Thank you. Do we have other questions or comments? Go ahead, Maria.
Yeah, I was interested in that idea of a death cafe. So maybe you could tell us a bit, like, what does it look like? What happens in there?
Sure. I tried to join too, and then COVID happened, and then they stopped meeting up. Basically, it is an idea that you can join in, usually a coffee shop, something kind of casual, in a group, and talk about whatever you want with regards to death. It can be your own mortality, it can be bereavement, but the idea is to have normalizing conversations around dying. And I've actually played with the idea with one of my co-researchers about doing that for people with intellectual disability. And I think that rocks. I think that rocks that it's coming from my co-researchers. I think that that rocks that that's coming more normalized. And again, this would depend on the culture, right? If this was a culture that might be superstitious or just may not be really okay with talking about this with a stranger, which is totally normal. And I am really pleased that I had participants at all who wanted to talk to a stranger and a foreigner in that country about death. But I think that we can kind of work to have those smaller death cafes. And the thing is, that is very firmly within thanatology. And so I think that needs to be a marriage between the kind of the social focus on death and dying as a cultural institution with healthcare, with spiritual care, with social services, because they all go together. You don't die without those things being somewhat in play, because they all affect you at the end of life, because it's not just the end of your physical being and your health, it is the end of everything about you. And I think sometimes that aspect is too big to comprehend, and so people don't try. They try to keep it within healthcare. They try to keep it within kind of a very small place. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Will you please introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, my name is Tip, and I used to study with research with my master's degree. And I mean, I just wanted to share a little bit because, like, the past few days, and my friends were just like, mention that I would like to everyone to remember me with this smile. And then he was just post on his Facebook, and then he was like mentioned about I also would like to have this kind of song and theme on my funeral. And after that, yeah, he committed suicide. And before that, it's been a sign. And then everyone was just saying that, yeah, laughing or not really mention or really, really discuss about it. And then we were just like, yeah, we ignoring it. But this is something that we need to talk about, and it's very normal to talk to. But yeah, and it's he's gone, but we see that is something that we really need to talk to when we are still alive. Yeah, thank you for addressing this up.
Thank you for sharing that with us, and I'm sorry about your loss. I think that now I'm doing a scoping review as part of my PhD about research that has been done on death and dying broadly with people with intellectual disability, including suicide. I haven't really found anything on intellectual disability and suicide, and I think that is a large mistake, because I think that that is something that is with death and that is with end of life. And most of the things that people talked about during the focus group were, of course, access and of course what they wanted, but also what they wanted with them, like what kind of music they wanted played, what kind of movies they would want. And I think that that is incredibly important, because the more we normalize this kind of conversations, the more we can get closer to actually having more conversations about mental health and about death and dying, about how much it upsets us, because we don't often have a chance to talk about what upsets us if it's not normalized, right? Depending on the culture you're in. So if there's no studies, for example, on intellectual disability and suicide, I think that that is, or very little. I think that's indicative of the same kind of thing I'm talking about, is who's in charge of the research, who's in charge of funding, and who is hesitant to bring up those questions, who's hesitant to bring up that topic.
Thank you very much, Marisa, for raising such an important area of life and death to explore, and such a neglected area. I think it's one more example of the importance of the research that's being conducted within the DARE project. Just really, thank you so much. And now we have the final presenter. And I just wanted to say that after this presentation, we will all go straight down to the first floor in the room where we started today, and for just the final remarks and closing of this conference. So I assume that the people who are online need to, do they need to? I'll repost the link. Okay, Joe will send you the link, so you need to change links, and we need to change floors. So our next presenter is Maria Gomez, and she is going to talk about human rights, participatory research with persons with disabilities. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Maria, I'm from Spain, and I'm doing my PhD in social policy at the University of Lisbon at the Institute for Political Science and Social Policy. And what I've done is I worked with two co-researcher groups, one group of autistic women that are organized as a DPO, and a group of people with intellectual disabilities who came together from different services and did not know each other. Some did not. We worked online due to the pandemic. We tried to like postpone it, but the pandemic kept on going on, so we had to do it online. And the way I did it was using the human rights-based participatory methodology, which uses the CRPD as a framework to conduct this work. And the way I recruited participants was co-researchers, was thanks to an idea by Clina de Wallace. I don't really know how to pronounce her surname, but yeah, she's a researcher at the CDLP. And I did an inverted job offer, so people could hire me to do the research with me. And what I offered was training and doing a research project together. People could choose whatever they wanted to do. In the end, most of them chose to do both. And I trained them in doing research during 8 sessions. We networked with other researchers because it was important to me that they heard about research and disability rights and social policy from other researchers, not just from me. And we did dissemination actions together. So my co-researchers, my autistic women group, what they did was they studied the access to a diagnosis, a disability certificate, and how that helped in enjoying the right to employment, higher education, and health. And the group of co-researchers with intellectual disabilities looked at the impact of COVID in their lives. So they focus specifically in Madrid, right? And my findings in this area are around different things, but mainly is that funding is really necessary for DPOs, because once you start collaborating with people with disabilities, you get so many invitations to speak at places, to participate. Can you review this document? Can you include us in? Can you come and speak here? Can you write a chapter? We got invited, which was great, to write a chapter for another university, but that's a lot of work. And while I could pay them to do my co-research project, I supported them to do all these other actions. That's not sustainable. Like in the end, we're constantly inviting the same people to do the work, and we burn them out because there's this sense of urgency. Like if I don't do it, nobody else will. And in my case, my co-researchers from Tepama, from the group of autistic women, were mothers, were working, were fully employed, had their own issues to deal with, and it was very tricky to find time for them to do all the stuff I was asking them to do, they wanted to do. And for instance, we had a meeting with a policymaker, and he changed the appointment like 5 times, which obviously you accommodate because he's a policymaker and you are interested in having that meeting. But on the other hand, that meant a lot of working around for them on their schedule, making time at work, because many of them haven't told at their employment place that they are activists or that they belong to a DPO. So that means, you have to ask for time off as vacations, or I don't know, they kind of struggled with that a lot. So I really think funding is necessary, and especially in Spain, funding is mainly directed at service provision, and I think that is in conflict with acting as self-representation or in participation. Like right now, we have lots of service providers participating actively in the name of people with disabilities, and now they're trying to incorporate people with disabilities on their boards, but that's not the same. And I think the fact that they monopolize the funding is problematic. And we can also, like, and for instance, the BAMA always says, we don't want to provide services. I don't want to have to hire people to do services. I think that's somebody else's job. My job is to participate. My job is for us to meet, to talk about our issues, and it's not to work providing services or support. The second point I found is that participation is not only consultation. So very often in public policies on spaces, it seems like it's consultation. Huh? We published this very long policy draft, which is already really advanced. It's at a very advanced stage. So there's very little you can change at times, or it's even very much focused on, you have to already know what the logic of that document is and why they are doing it in a certain way. And there's very little background information unless you read all that legal background thing, which is not really accessible or understandable for people who are not specialized in lobbying or in being part of that environment. For me, participation includes sharing information and sharing the deliberation process, and that was really enriching. It takes time, obviously, because you have to, you go back and forth. It's messy. I read a lot. I read this word a lot while I was doing the literature review, that participatory research is messy. And I think this is really why, because you think about things together and you're unsure and you go back on them and then you review them afterwards. But I think it's way more enriching, and you actually think about the questions much more if you include people from the very beginning, rather than asking them to comment on something that you've already closed. And it also includes decision making, which is not very common. But for all these three steps, you do need resources, and it has to be accessible. And what I learned with the accessible part, it's not that you think about it at the beginning and implement it, that's it, but that many needs come up while you're doing it. So you have to be really flexible about how you provide information. For instance, one of the things I introduced in the middle of the project was recording videos before our meetings, summarizing what we had spoken about and presenting what I was going to talk about, or what I was suggesting to talk about in the next session. And nobody had ever told me do that, but once I started doing it, because I felt that it helped us get the discussion started, that was really helpful. And I think you have to be kind of open to those changes. Then participation is definitely a learning process, not only for the participants or the co-researchers, but also for the researcher and for all sides. Like, I think I sought feedback constantly, and I kept notes of what I was thinking while I was doing it, how I felt afterwards, because you have to like review constantly how you're doing it, how you're feeling. If you are constructing the decision process in a certain way to guide it inadvertently, but you're kind of trying to steer it. And all those things are there because I felt responsible for the research and the project, and I wanted to be successful. For instance, one of my co-researchers left in April. He did the training and he did a couple of new sessions, but in April, the restrictions lifted and he was very, very active in sports. So basically, he just wanted to go back to his team, and he was competing on a national level. And he left, and some of my co-researchers felt that was because he was not interested in the project, and we talked to him about it. And I was very aware of, or I tried to be very aware of that, not feeling that this was failure or that this was something I had done wrong or that he was doing wrong, but rather that people have a limited time, and you cannot force people to stay or to if they committed at the beginning that they have to. So I think that's something you have to keep on being open to those learning, to that learning curve. And lastly, and that was really important for my PhD, especially from that social policy perspective, is the type of evidence that we gather from participatory research. I was lucky because the subjects they chose have a lot of literature. So unlike Marissa's topic, there was so much study being done on the impact of COVID. And funnily enough, all the studies done in Spain focus on how services suffered under a pandemic and a lockdown, and how there were not sufficient masks and protections. But none of them looked at how people with intellectual disabilities were dealing, like they couldn't choose with whom they spent their lockdown. They were subject to restrictive measures that went way beyond the lockdown measures. Some of them told us they hadn't seen their partners for a year and a half, and that wasn't their choice. That was kind of imposed by the services that support them. So I really felt like the evidence they brought to the table and the questions they asked were bringing evidence that we were largely ignoring in the rest of the studies. And the Autistic Women group brought very interesting evidence around accessing the disability certificate. And they also brought, we found so many little or invisible gaps that we tend to ignore in the broader social policy literature or even discussions that nobody thinks about, and they just made them really clear. For instance, not being able to access it because you don't have, because autism is not recognized as a disability in the certificate list of impairments. But that was never highlighted because most people who access the disability certificate are people with intellectual disabilities and autism. So that had never occurred to the minister. And then the use of that certificate, like they had the use, and in Spain there's a policy for at the workplace if you have a certificate, but because they felt unsafe disclosing their disability, they never made use of that, so they couldn't really benefit from that right. So yeah, I'm going to finish here because I think, yeah, I'm on time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. This is your research is an area that I share interest in, and so does the respondent, who is Anna Arnstein-Korsleik, who is going to give her response. And Anna and I have also worked together trying to make some guidelines and, interest in this area of research. So welcome, Anna, and go ahead, please.
Hi, Ranvik. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Maria. I'm just going to apologize now to everyone. I have COVID. I'm at the end of it, but I sound terrible still. But of course, I didn't want to miss today. But I think I just wanted to first start by sharing or agreeing with Ranvig on how wonderful it is that you have focused on this, Maria, and used this methodology for your PhD. As Ranvig said, there's a number of us that have been working for many years on creating some guidelines around this, and perhaps you've seen the article that I think we published in 2020, I think it was, really outlining. I mean, I hate to call them fully aspirational, but they are. They're quite strong guidelines around how we thought or we think participatory research should be done, or actually really any research related to disability. And I think something that's really exciting for me in listening to your presentation is that it sounds to me that you've been able to meet a lot of those benchmarks that we were trying to set. And I think when we set them, we thought that it would actually be much longer before people could really do research in this participatory way. So it's really wonderful to see that it's happening, and that you're doing it so well. So thank you so much for that. excuse me. I just wanted to share with you an example from my own work of sort of similar methodology. And the reason I wanted to share it is because I think so is because it relates to the question I have for you, which is around aims of research. So the example is the Unfitness to Plead project, with which I know some people are already familiar with, but it's a project that myself and Bernadette McSherry in Melbourne, at the University of Melbourne, led from 2015 to 2018. And in that project, we used, I mean, it was conventional in the sense that we applied for funding from a government body. We got that funding, and we were able to carry out a project. So it had that constraint in that, as you spoke about, Maria, that way of getting funding, which is the primary way of getting research funding, it's very difficult to do co-produced research or participatory design in that context. And the way we did that was that in order to decide what topic we were going to ask for funding in relation to, we spent a lot of time with community groups, with disabled people's organizations in Australia, to figure out what areas were in particular need of research and change, and especially related to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities too. And what many of the organizations were saying, in fact, I think almost all of them, is that this issue of people with disabilities and disproportionately Indigenous people with disabilities being held indefinitely due to findings of unfitness to plead in the criminal justice system was, and still is, unfortunately, a significant problem in Australia, although change is starting to occur now. So we took that sort of voice from the community and then developed our own project. And the reason that I'm talking about this is really, I think, to highlight some of the existing challenges that you already also highlighted there, Maria, and also to highlight the sort of the difficulty with the driving force behind the research, and the sort of your research questions, essentially. I think it's so important for the research, and yet I think it's one of the most difficult areas to ensure co-production and participation. And then that Unfitness to Plead project was almost completely co-produced, in terms of all of the work we did was co-produced with Indigenous people with disabilities and non-Indigenous people with disabilities. And the training we ended up carrying out in community legal centers, again, was co-delivered by both Indigenous people with disabilities and non-Indigenous people with disabilities. So that other side of the project, so the actual carrying out, while there's the same logistical difficulties that co-production has, once we had the funding, in a sense, that's easier, I think. So and then we actually were able to go ahead and use that methodology on 2 projects following on, and a project related to consumer transactions, and then a project related to generally training lawyers on how to better maximize autonomy for clients, and particularly for disabled clients. So what my question for you really is if you could tell a bit more about how you managed that. And it sounds to me, I think it perhaps I'm just looking for more information. It sounds to me that you sort of allowed your participants, your co-researchers, to choose their own aims. And then your overall aim for your PhD is an analysis of the methodology. But I would love to hear more about that, because, as I said before, I think that is one of the most challenging aspects, is that actually first stage of research, is those research questions and aims, and how do we make sure that that's co-produced, and that's coming from the ground up, and not from the other way. And then my other question is, what do you think your findings mean for the realization of the rights in the CRPD? Do you think that we can use methodologies like the one that you've used and the one you've created to better realize the rights in the CRPD? And how could we do that? Of course, no need to have a perfect answer presented because it's a big question. But I'm presenting the question because I think in many ways that's the ultimate goal. That's why co-production of research is so important, because without it, our research isn't going to be effective in achieving the realization of the rights within the CRPD. So I hope I didn't ask too many questions, but your presentation was so interesting that it just stimulated a lot of interesting thoughts from me. So if you have a chance to answer any of those, that would be great.
Thank you, Anna. Well, first thing, yes, I've read that article, and it's basically the methodology I'm following, and that's been my guideline in deciding how to do things. I have to say, like, one of the things my co-researchers most liked was getting paid, and that really stems from that paper, and that was very important to them. Like they and even participants who then, like, when we presented the report, when they found out, they were like, oh, that's so important. Like, we never get paid for what we do, and they invite us to so many things, and we always are speaking about ourselves, and we never get paid. So, and that really does come, I mean, directly, you're cited in my thesis many times. So yeah, that comes from there. Yeah, so the design of the research question, what I did is, and this was responding to what they wanted, is we used training sessions on why a research question is important, and then we had a meeting on the actual co-research. So we looked at other research and what they had done, whether we found it interesting or not. I had a problem finding good research or accessible research in Spanish. There's many more examples in English, and the Irish Inclusive Research Network is one of them, and I actually used them in the end and just had to translate over their reports because there is not good material in Spanish to show what I wanted them to think about. And the designing the research question took much more time than I thought initially, right? So I had like 2 or 3 sessions for that, and in one case it took like a month and many debates. And what I did over Zoom was creating small group rooms, like, so they would go into the rooms and debate and then come back, and I wouldn't be in those rooms, and I think that was important. And then we would vote on the subject and on formulating the questions. And for one of the groups, it was really frustrating. They got really frustrated with discussing the research question and honing out what the actual aims were, because some people thought we weren't challenging the ableism enough. Other people were really critical about this concept of ableism still. So that was difficult to manage, and it took a while. And I think that's where you as a researcher come in and have to say, this is normal. This is how long it takes to design a research question. This is not because we're not doing a good job. This is actually how long it takes. And it's really important that we spend this time doing this here. But it was a challenge. But yeah, I think for me, it was important that that we did everything together. And the other day I was asked on my role as a researcher there, I did not influence, well, I think I didn't. I mean, I would have to go over my notes to do that. The process of deciding the topic. I wasn't too keen on doing the impact on COVID because I thought we've heard enough about COVID, but it was really important to them. So I just said, okay, let's go with that. And the other one, I thought we were touching on too many topics, like when they said access to higher education, employment, disability certificate, diagnosis, but they wouldn't budge. So I just said, well, just go with it. You have to do it now. So yeah, I think you just take more time and allow for spaces where you're not present, and then let them present their findings back, and then help them formulate it. Like, sometimes what's useful is because you were not in the discussions, you have a fresher mind when you hear the discussions and kind of make it work in the formulation of the question or in the aims, or if you have a little bit more experience doing research, you know how to tackle certain disagreements. Like you can kind of write that out in a report or in the memo. And I think this methodology does really help us monitor how the CRPD is implemented, and also it really helps think about what solutions people can want, because many of the barriers my co-researcher identified, they already knew the solution to them. Like some of them were really simple, and it wasn't a matter of having another study but they actually knew them, and they cited them and they suggested them. So I do think this is the way to move forward with the CRPD, definitely. And I find it hard to imagine doing it differently. I mean, I know you can't do every single research project with the participation, but they did ask me for more. So my co-researchers are keen on continuing doing this kind of work. And lastly, yeah, funding is a big challenge. Some of my co-researchers who have social benefits had problems accepting getting paid because they were concerned they would lose their social benefits. Some potential co-researchers didn't participate because of that. And what we did was we paid them as if they were speakers at a conference. So they got a contract for a 1 week in August as if they were speaking at a conference, which is not ideal. It's not the right way, but that was the administrative solution we had to this. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. So the floor is open for questions online or in the room. Marissa?
Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. Maria will deny this, but she helped me a lot in the creation of my own research and my plan with co-researchers. She was a wealth of information there, and I really appreciate it. I was wondering, within the Spanish context, about having co-researchers, researchers with intellectual disabilities. I wonder how much, if at all, you encountered any sort of resistance, not even necessarily gatekeeping, but resistance to the legitimacy of co-production as legitimate in academia. I find that there is a lot of pushback between, especially from the co-production side. For me, the research question was set by myself, so it wasn't necessarily fully participatory in that way. And there is, as you know, a lot of discussions around that. So within the Spanish context, did you encounter that at all? Or do you think that is something that is beyond Spain, that is something that is found in academia in general, that kind of attitude towards co-production? Especially, I mean, it's beyond bias. It's people wondering about their ability. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you, Marissa. We attended the European Sociology Association conference in Barcelona online, and we had two panelists with us. One of them actively engaged with our evidence and made a contrast with his, because he had studied the impact on young people, which was like very in opposition with ours. But the other one completely ignored us and used really difficult terms. And I mean, I couldn't even follow, because what I was doing, I was summing up what he was saying and I didn't understand much of it. So yeah, but I did find that the association made a lot of efforts to accommodate us. I mean, there's lots of barriers still, but they did try hard. And some people are very interested in this type of research, and some people dismiss it clearly, and they just think you're doing charity. And sometimes you have the energy to engage, and sometimes you don't. Yeah.
So last chance to comment or have a question. Okay, if not, then I want to conclude this by thanking you, Maria, and the rest of the presenters very, very much. This has been incredibly informing and encouraging. And I must say, as a senior person, that it is so wonderful to see young people come up through the ranks doing such wonderful work and, continuing the work. And I want to thank all the respondents. Thank you so much for taking the time to read and to share your thoughts and comments with our young researchers. And I just want to say just thank you and hallelujah, we are there at the end, and you did such a great job. So now we go down to the first floor to the final session of this conference. Thank you so much, everyone.